And you're live.
Okay, thank you so much, Virginia. Hi, everyone. I'm ML Wong, and I am super excited to be hosting this QuaranCon panel on writing fight sequences. If this is the first you're hearing of QuaranCon, please check out our Artist Alley at QuaranCon2020.com. There should be links to other panels there, as well as virtual tables where a lot of our authors and featured artists are selling their stuff. So be sure to check that out. This panel, I'm here with Lee C. Conley, Damian Larkin, Patrick Leclerc, Anna Smith-Spark, and Adrian Tchaikovsky. So I believe we have a really decent spread of sci-fi, fantasy, horror, all the genres represented, as well as a lot of interesting background experience in like history, fencing, martial arts and stuff. So before we get started, I'm gonna have you guys go around and just introduce yourself, your books, the genre you write in, and the flavor of action scene you specialize in, and any background that's informed the way that you write action scenes. So let's see, Lee, would you like to kick us off?
You're going to put me first. Okay, so my name is Lee Conley. That's fine. So I'm Lee C. Conley. I'm the author of the Dead Sagas, which I have one here. Whoa, knocking things over. Dead Sagas there. Now, it's a dark fantasy horror. I generally write a lot of dark fantasy and a lot of horror, sort of blended together on that book. Along with my friend Damien over here, we co-founded the British and Irish writing community, and we started a magazine called Bard of the Isles as well. So we're part of the team behind that as well. When I'm not writing, I'm actually a martial arts instructor. I do historic European martial arts, specialize in longsword and tomahawk and knife and saber. Yeah, that's kind of my background really, and obviously some of that goes into my writing as well. As far as my fight scenes go, I'll try and put a bit of everything in really. I do some sort of big, sort of epic ones. My books are sort of zombie based, so there's a lot of zombies and guys fighting, and there's some one-on-one fights as well. But yeah, I mean, I'll talk about that in a bit. So yeah.
All right, and let's see, Anna, you want to go next?
So, hi, I'm Anna Smith-Spark. I'm the author of the Empires of Dust trilogy, which is, I have them here, The Court of Broken Knives, The Tower of Living and Dying, and The House of Sacrifice, which are, as my Twitter handle, Queen of Grimdark would suggest, grimdark, dark fantasy, epic fantasy. I have no practical fighting experience at all. I am severely dyspraxic, which means I have very poor, it's essentially a form of congenital brain damage where I have very poor coordination skills. I can't drive, I can barely tie my shoelaces. I'm kind of I'm basically semi-literate with a pen and paper, let alone being trusted with edged weaponry. So yeah, I have never had practical experience of dealing of weaponry of any kind or of being in a fight of any kind. Were I to be in a fight of any kind, I would be beaten to a pulp immediately. I have a BA in classical history, and I guess my fight scenes are informed by that. My special subject was Alexander the Great. I spent 3 years at universities basically translating the Iliad and reading and studying the history of Alexander the Great and his successors. So I write big battles which are very heavily influenced by classical military accounts of battles and big. So I love battle schematics. I love military history. But I also write very much about the kind of sensory experience, what I think is probably emotionally going on when one's experiencing war, fighting, whether it's just sort of a bar fight or a huge battle, the aesthetic experience, the sensory experience, the emotional experience, and the political experience of war and violence.
All right, Patrick, how about you?
So, I've written actually across a number of fantasy and science fiction genres. I did the first thing that I published that was it was a finalist in last year's self-published blog off was Out of Nowhere, which is an urban fantasy starring an immortal character, which was able to bring a lot of historical stuff in there. I've also done a sword and sorcery series, which is just kind of like in the style of the old pulps. So it's more like a Fritz Lieber, Robert E. Howard kind of style. And I get to put a lot of sword fighting, a lot of swashbuckling in that. And I did a science fiction Space Marine story, which is much different, but it's still, there's a lot of combat and a lot of stuff in there. My background is very varied. Right out of high school, I joined the Marines. So I have a little bit of knowledge of the military, silent and modern weapons. I was in the infantry. Then when I went to college, I studied history. So I have a little bit of the historical. I joined the UNH sport fencing team, and I did specialize in the saber. And a couple of years ago, I got into HEMA, which is a lot of fun. Mostly saber and rapier, I have a lot of fun with because it's enough of my foil and saber stuff from sport translated over. If you want to beat me, throw me a longsword because I'm garbage. But it was enough of just some exposure to that. And I've done a little bit of archery. I've done a little bit of horseback riding. I've done a little bit of, if it can't make me money, I've done it. I'm also working as a paramedic now. So I've seen the other end. I've seen, you know, some of the injuries and what people can and can't, you know, roll with. And I tend to write my fight sequences. It changes dramatically based on the genre and the form of book, whether it's really gritty or really kind of like lighter. But I always tend to focus, it's very individual character focused. There are big battles, but the big battle is happening around them. And the scene follows a character or a few characters. So I tend to do a lot of tightly focused stuff. Thank you.
All right, awesome. And yeah, I definitely knew your name because of Spiffbo. And when I saw Patrick, I was like, right, the ambulance guy, because that was like such a unique thing to see on the cover of a fantasy book. So I still haven't gotten to that, but I'm super curious about reading that one.
Read it before you read the reviews I got last year.
Oh, it's fine. You're fine. Adrian, you wanna?
Yeah, so I write quite a wide range of fantasy and science fiction. So a bit of space opera, a bit of hard sci-fi, a bit of big scale epic fantasy, a bit of sort of smaller scale heroic character-based fantasy. I have done a lot of LARP. I did a few years of stage fighting training, and I've done a few years of European longsword fighting with a few excursions into other areas. My main focus in writing fights, especially in my fantasy series where they mostly turn up, is bringing the fantastical into the fighting. So how does the paradigm of the fight change in the world if people can do X, and if that's a common and naturally accepted thing that they can do?
All right, awesome. And Damien.
Hey everyone, I'm Damien Larkin. I'm from Dublin, Ireland. My first or my debut novel, Big Red, came out last year in May, published by Dancing Lemur Press. It's a military science fiction novel, deals primarily with British and Irish soldiers serving on Mars, and it went on to be longlisted for the BSFA award for best novel last year, which I thought was really cool. In terms of experience, I spent about 9 years in Taekwondo. I was a black belt, and this is going back a good decade anyway, so I haven't actually trained since then. I also spent 7 years in the Irish Reserve Defence Forces in the infantry, and I finished off as a weapons specialist in a support company. So we got to play with a lot of really cool kind of weapons like the 60mm vector mortar, the 84mm anti-tank gun. So a lot of kind of weapons used to support infantry kind of operations movement. So I have to say it was a fantastic experience. Along with Lee Connolly, as he said earlier on, myself, Lee, and Phil Parker formed the British and Irish writing community about a year and a half ago, and we've grown from strength to strength in the last year. We've launched Bard of the Isles online magazine, which is, I have to say, it's doing fantastically in terms of like getting the works of Indian traditional or traditionally published authors out there, specifically with an Irish and a British ethos. So yeah, I'm glad to be here.
All right, thank you guys so much. So you can see why I was really excited about this panel. Everybody's got like a high level of expertise in something really interesting, be it Alexander the Great or Longsword. I'm Emma Wong. I wrote The Sword of Kaigan, which is a finalist in this year's SPIFBO, so we're still waiting on the final scores, and I'm trying really hard to not think about that and get too nervous. But so this is a Japanese-inspired military fantasy with elemental superpowers thrown in there. So it's a lot of sword fighting and battles, but they're elemental superpowers. So the realism only goes so far. So our first question is actually about realism in fighting. And between historical research and practical experience, obviously, there's a whole lot you can know about fighting. There's a whole lot of technical stuff you can get into, but I'm interested in where your line is, how much of that stuff you actually put in, where you find there's a conflict between creating realistic fight sequences and entertaining ones, and where you sacrifice realism for entertainment value, or vice versa, or be it entertainment value or like emotional punch, whatever you're trying to achieve with your fight sequences. So anybody want to take that one first?
I think that realism, there has to be enough realism that the reader feels that it makes sense. But the story is paramount. Character development's paramount. It's got to be entertaining. It's got to be the readers have to enjoy reading it more so than it has to be 100% accurate. I think it's nice to not be wildly inaccurate, but I think with a little bit of enough knowledge, you can gain enough just by YouTube, by doing a little bit of research, just to understand what the capabilities of weapons and stuff are. But other than that, it's the story. Like I said, one of the greatest fight scenes ever filmed was the fights in Princess Bride, which is not realistic rapier fighting, but it's some of the most entertaining stuff that you're ever going to see. And if you look at those fights, there's character development throughout it. There's the big duel on the Cliffs of Insanity, and then there's a brilliant like 12-second scene where Inigo is rescuing Wesley in the castle, and a bunch of guards attack him, and it's like in 2 seconds he takes out 4 guards, which shows a lot about him. And then you see Count Rugen turn a guard and then turn and run away, which shows a lot about him. So you get a lot of character development, a lot of humor, but it's not real fighting. But it's awesome.
You shocked me. I'm so crushed. I think for me also it depends on genre.
Yes,
absolutely.
Within this, even talking within fantasy and science fiction, whether you're writing, a very gritty, realistic, fairly near future science fiction about humans fighting on Mars, say, that's going to be what you're doing there will be very different to if you're writing gloriously absurd, Moorcock-esque high fantasy, where what you're doing is totally different. You're kind of it's what you're trying to achieve within your story, within the genre you're writing in, within your story, within the kind of political ethos of what you're writing. All of that is going to hugely affect. No one expects realism in pulp, swords and sorcery. You can have the 2 guys back to back fighting off the army, because that's why one of the reasons people love things like swords and sorcery. But that just kind of wouldn't work in a very realistic near future science fiction. It's what kind of it's how it works in the confines of your story, not necessarily how it works within actual reality.
Yeah, I mean,
There's always going to be a.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, there's always going to be a bit of a sliding scale with your audience, in that, depending on the sort of area you're writing in, you will have an audience who will and won't accept certain things, and then there will be a section of your audience who are perhaps sort of more highly read in the subject, and they will not, for example, accept, yes, with enough force he stabbed him through the iron breastplate, because that's not how that kind of thing works. And a number of other tropes you see in films and in books, that there's a chunk of your readership who will get really, really irate because they know just enough to know that it's not good fight writing, and there was a better way to do it, which was more elegant.
Yeah, I mean,
Having said that, sorry, go on.
I was going to say, there's always some eagle-eyed, really well-informed reader who will pick up on the inaccuracies. So, sorry, I was just adding that.
No,
there's always someone. Yes,
yeah,
there
always.
Someone.
But also, I mean, in the you were talking about how much of the knowledge goes into the book. I think the greatest skill for writing fights is learning how little of it as possible you can then put in.
Absolutely.
So all of that specialist knowledge that you've acquired by whatever means then has to be kind of concentrated until it's taking up as few words in the actual narrative as possible, because otherwise you end up with a very, very informative but incredibly dull series of complicated fight moves.
Absolutely. I mean, I think...
You want to you want to go, Lee, and then we'll come back to
sure.
Anna.
See, I think one of the things I find really grating when I'm trying to read is over description of a fight scene. I mean, sometimes you'll get someone who obviously knows their trade, and they've just made it really boring and really drawn out. And I mean, I've been guilty of that in some of my early drafts, and I quickly refine it down, and it gets edited out, and quite I've had to rather painfully take out a few beautifully crafted, accurate pieces of research and things, but it's just the most important thing is dramatic effect should always and the reader's enjoyment should always overrule the realism. So I mean, I try and keep it real, but at the same time, what's more important is the actual writing and the actual story that you're telling. So that's why I always try and do it. So
yeah, that's really important, because that was actually, because I was going to say the absolute sort of flip side to that is, so for me, so I have invisible disabilities. I have really poor coordination. I'm useless at sport. I have no interest in learning I have no interest in doing any of this stuff, because I couldn't do it. I do not say that in some kind of, oh, well, anyone could do it. I have no interest in doing it, and I know I couldn't do it. It's not something I wouldn't be able to do it, and I don't want to be able to do it. So when I came to write, when I was writing The Court of Broken Knives, which was my first novel, it was an epic fantasy. Epic fantasy is absolutely what I love. It was very clear from, for those who've read it, the spoiler alert on page 4 when the dragon turns up. It was a big epic fantasy with lots of battles. But I was really tiptoeing writing around the first big fight scene, really, really scared about, I can't write this, I cannot write this, I cannot write epic fantasy because I cannot write a battle scene. Because I was the last person to be picked at netball. I have never been in a fight in my life. I will never be in a fight in my life. I am totally unphysical. I could be quite happily just a brain in a jar typing. I know about fighting, and it took me weeks to get up the courage to sit down and write that fight scene, because I was so scared of what I don't know, I don't have the practical experience to write this. And I think a lot of people, and yes, a lot of people, particularly women, and obviously particularly anyone with physical disabilities or health issues, has that kind of, I don't know this stuff. I've never had practical experience of this stuff. How can I do this? And it is a kind of block. It is a huge blocker. But it's not about the practical experience. It's about thinking about how you'd feel in that situation. It's about thinking about how you'd respond. It's about thinking about the emotions you might be feeling, the intensity of what you might be feeling, the sensations you might be feeling. What has to happen in the fight to get you from the beginning of the fight to the end of the fight with your character in the place they need to be for the fight when the fight ends. It's all that stuff. It's not the technique. And I think people really kind of, if there's one thing people take away from this, it's don't feel you have to have that practical knowledge.
Yeah, and I think that's especially
I really don't. I'm never going to have it.
Like in the age of the internet, because there are so many great resources available to us. I've never fought with a longsword, but I could email Lee and just ask him about it, and then extrapolate the emotional experience of it from there. So I think that that's a really good point, especially when we have so many areas of expertise just available to us because of the internet. And Damien, you had a thing to say way back, and I wanted to make sure that we got.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, it was kind of just tying into what everyone's saying in terms of the realism thing. I think the way I kind of look at it is I'd agree with what's been said. You don't need to have this expertise. Like, I certainly have never kind of wielded a long sword, and I've still written kind of Roman era imperial battle type stories, but I think coming from the genre I write, and that's, I think, tying in with what Patrick was saying earlier, I specifically write a lot of military science fiction. That'd be my kind of bread and butter. It's what I kind of love to do, just drawing on my own experience. And I'd say 99% of the time, the vast majority of the readers will take a scene, they'll love it, they'll enjoy it, but you'll always have that 1% who kind of like maybe nitpick on it. And maybe it's just with military science fiction, because it's very hardcore. You have a certain group of people who kind of tend to read it more than the vast majority of science fiction writers. If you don't do a certain scene, no matter how well it's written, if it's say a section in an attack or a company in an attack, and it's just people just running straight at the enemy, they'll pick up on that, and they will kind of like comment about it, or kind of I suppose mention it in reviews, or kind of say it to you when you see them in conventions. So the one thing that I always kind of keep in mind in terms of those kind of, I suppose, more modern style scenes is I try and think of like the war movies that I watched when I was growing up, and it was back then, it was literally just my first concept of modern warfare was two people lining up and just running at each other and just kind of shooting guns, and that was it. And I thought, wow, that's so cool, But realistically, for anyone who wants to do a kind of very modern kind of style scene, I always say to them, look at Band of Brothers.
Yeah.
Fantastic, absolutely fantastic series. But even I think it's in the first episode, you see I think Lieutenant Winters, he's hitting the German position, and that was the first time, and I think it's still taught in a lot of military academies, but that's what we call a section in attack, or maybe it was a platoon in attack at the time. But it's how the different I suppose segments of a section, which is in Ireland it's like 9 people and a corporal. I think it's a little bit different in the UK. But it's how a section works within a platoon or works within a company, and how they can kind of, I suppose, lay down suppressive fire, and what their individual objectives are to achieve the overall mission. So I suppose, I absolutely agree. I've never served in combat. Ireland's a neutral country. I would have been trained in how to do a lot of this, but I don't think you need to have served in there to kind of get it right. But at the same time, you will always get that very small segment of readers who will kind of pick up on that and I suppose give you a little bit of grief over it.
What's also really useful is so you can, for going back to the early modern period and then the classical period, of course you get written accounts of people who've been in war. So if you read Tolstoy's Sebastopol sketches, if you read accounts of people in the First World War, you can read published diaries of people who were just privates in the First World War. There's an amazing collection called 1864, which is a collection of German and Danish accounts of the Danish-Prussian War. There's all kinds of stuff. There's classical sources. There's, anyone who was writing in classical Greece would have been involved in warfare. You could read loads of accounts of people from all different periods of history, using all different kinds of weaponry, from the generals to the foot soldiers, and get a sense of what they're experiencing. And some of it won't make any sense to you, because it doesn't make any sense to anyone now, because when someone who was a Greek hoplite is talking about, using technical jargon, talking about what they're doing, that we have no idea really what they're talking about, but you can get a sense of you can get a feel of what life was like. And it's that kind of source that is really useful to get a sense of what it's actually like as an individual to be involved in that situation.
Yes, it's definitely all about research, isn't it? And say my background with the martial arts, and you guys with the military backgrounds, and that's just one form of research. But at the end of the day, we are all in books. We're all on the internet, constantly researching, like so many other elements. I mean, it's just one form of research, really, isn't it? The practical abilities. It certainly helps in a way. It gives you sort of an understanding of mechanics and martial situations and weapons and things like that. But at the end of the day, actually, I find myself envisaging fights in my living room, I'll be sat there and I'll be, I'll be like running through. My wife will walk in, like, what are you doing with that sword? And I'm just figuring out a scene. And then I'll say it'll all boil down into, 1 or 2 sentences in the end, but it just helps me get it, visualize it in my head. But at the end of the day, it's just research, and we can all do research from books and accounts.
We've all felt things as well. We've all felt extreme physical pain. We've all felt physical exhaustion. I love doing extremely hardcore aerobics. I'm crap at it, but I love doing it. That physical sense of absolute adrenaline and then exhaustion at the end. We've all stood really near the edge of the tube platform, and a tube's come whizzing towards, this massive thing, all the noise, the fear of something coming towards you, that terrible fear when someone pulls you out the road and there's a lorry that's just come behind you. We've all had those experiences of fear and danger and nearly being hit by something. Even someone who has had someone like myself who has not had any, who's essentially mildly physically disabled, basically. We've all had experiences that you can draw on you when you're thinking about how it would feel, what you'd be thinking, or how you might respond, that you can just draw on, extrapolate.
Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely.
It's the emotion of the characters. It's the emotion that you need to get across onto the page to, what their experience are, what they're, from their point of view and how they think. That's what drives the story, not the technical breakdown of how it's done, and that's the thing. If people ask me for advice on that, which I'm not very qualified to give, but when they do, I tell them, make sure it's from character, rather than like a list of movements. It's how that person's feeling at the time, and that's what draws the readers, to carry on reading. That's what I think. Yeah. So that's what I try to do.
I think there's one. The place that the technical knowledge comes in often is refining your grasp of the logic of the situation. I think it's a lot like when you're building any kind of scene, when you're building a plot, when you're building a world. The key point is you're telling an account which has a comprehensible logic, and the more you know about how a mass battle would work, or how archery works, or anything like that, it informs your grasp of the logic, and you use that almost like a scaffolding to build the story on.
Yeah.
And occasionally, you can, whether it's a matter of, say, the military tactics, or knowledge of a particular weapon, or just a particular piece of nonsense science fiction you've thought up that sounds really cool, you can hang the scene off that and make it the crux point of the scene if you're able to make it appreciable to the audience without cluttering the narrative too much. So, because especially with, say, science fiction now, if you can resolve a fight with a particular elegant use of your completely made up technology, that can be a really fun thing to write and a really fun thing to read. And the same with magic in a fantasy book. You introduce your magic, you show people how it's done, and then you use a novel instance of that to break the walls of the fortress, or to get your hero where he needs to be. And so as long as you're following the train of the logic that you've set up, even if that logic is based on complete invention, that's kind of all you need for it to work.
That's really an interesting thing. That's one of the things that in my Sword and Sorcery series, I like to play with that a lot, because I had a character who started out, his background, he was a mercenary, he's very good at fighting, but then as he goes into these heroic, fantastic adventures, he has to learn to apply that to things that aren't real world, fighting someone invisible, fighting someone who, he fights a creature whose blood is toxic. And so you don't want to cut him, and his comment was the guy was probably best fought by someone else or with a bow and arrow. You didn't have that option. So how do you fight someone with a sword when if he bleeds on you, it's going to be bad. So it's you get to play with that in fantasy, and to a certain extent in science fiction, because you can invent a situation. Zero gravity changes a lot. An atmosphere that's not breathable changes a lot, where maybe you're not hurt, but if a weapon breaches your suit and you can't breathe, something that would be a minor inconvenience if you'd be grazed in a battle on Earth, but now that all your air is leaking out, now it's become a much more serious situation. So that kind of thing can really add a lot to a story. And again, it's technical stuff, but it's technical stuff that you make up.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. Yeah, Asians, you're both completely that. It's the eternal logic of the story.
Yes.
A position where it's not ending up in that position where you suddenly realize the guy's been fighting for the last 10 minutes in zero gravity with no atmosphere in a vacuum with his helmet smashed in, and suddenly you're like, well, somehow it was fine, or that kind of your one guy has got 30 orcs around them, killed them all. And it's that kind of, okay, that doesn't work. And that just doesn't work within the logic of your story.
Yeah, but it can work in the right story.
As long as it works, as long as it works in the logic of your story.
Exactly. Nobody
fine.
beats
It's when it just doesn't work.
Right. Boromir can wipe out 20 orcs and nobody blinks. And that's fine. It's part of the story. It's unlikely. You'd have to be really good to get away with that with nothing in the sword. But we accept it because it's heroic fantasy. Fine. I wouldn't do that I wouldn't have one of my Space Marines with a Bowie knife take out 20 guys, because that would be silly. But if it's heroic fantasy, it works, and it's
a different logic.
Consistent.
Yeah, so you guys kind of seamlessly went into the next topic, which is
we planned it completely.
Fantastical. Like, once you've decided how realistic, how grounded your fight scenes are going to be and what kind of technical stuff you're going to bring in, then let's drop, well, in my case I do elemental superpowers a lot because those are fun for me, or weirder things like acidic blood or space. So something that I guess a closing thought I wanted to have about the realism, dramatic effect, and integrating the fantastical that Damien brought up that I thought was really good, because you just said know your audience, and that goes with knowing your genre, which Patrick brought up. So like, if you've labeled something heroic fantasy, people aren't looking for something very grounded. They're looking for something more fantastical, more dramatic. But like you said, Damien, you have members of your audience who are going to pick apart the minutia of like the military terminology and stuff, and I guess you just have to know your reader base and determine how much you're gonna to that and who you're looking for.
I think that's half the battle, to be honest. Once you kind of understand who you're writing for, you don't have to tailor it specifically for an audience, but as long as you kind of have a bit of an inkling into what makes them tick, and the way I suppose I kind of figured it out a little bit the hard way. I'm only relatively new to writing in the grand scheme of things. I only started at the end of 2017, and I'm 34 now. I just one day decided I wanted to write this book that I had in my head for maybe 2 or 3 years before that, and I wrote about 100,000 words in about 3 months, another 6-7 weeks just drafting and getting it together, and I ended up self-publishing it. But before I did, I decided I kind of wanted to understand who I was aiming it for, and because it was more of a military style fantasy, I didn't know, who would read that, if it would be people who were kind of into epic fantasy or maybe dark fantasy. And the way I kind of, I suppose, pigeonholed my audience a little bit was using it's a free tool on Facebook, and it's called Audience Insights, and everyone has it on their homepage. You'll find it on your laptop and most of the Facebook mobile apps, but it allows you to put in demographic information based on different groups for the likes of Facebook ads. So you can kind of tweak what, like, say a segment of the American population. Say I wanted to find out for, take Big Red for an example, if I wanted to send an ad to them, I could maybe put in people who like maybe the movie Aliens 2, with all the Space Marines in it, and I can have a look at what their interests are. So what TV programs do they like? What kind of shops do they like? How likely are they to click on an ad, for example? And that will, if I can see a lot of similarities there to what I'm doing, I know that they'd be a target kind of audience. So I basically took the same approach to Big Red, even though my publisher was doing like a vast majority of the kind of advertising. I kind of obviously wanted to dig out and promo myself a little bit, but I had a look at who it was specifically would be more likely to pick up this book by using free tools like that. And I think once you kind of understand how you can kind of move from, hey, this is my book, I suppose screaming it on Twitter. You probably see it more often than not, people just sticking up these kind of ads and knowing that no one's going to see them. But when you have something a bit more focused, that you know who you can kind of reach out to and kind of connect with, I think that really goes a long way to kind of establishing yourself and getting, I suppose, a cadre of people interested in your work. So that's something I tell everybody, just have a look at Audience Insights. It's a fantastic resource.
Yeah. You should have done the marketing panel.
Next year.
I would have really appreciated that. But yeah, I just wanted to point to that, as far as, because people throw out general rules about realism and like, oh, here's what you can and can't do if a character is stabbed in a scene or something. But I think that a lot of the time that disregards genre and readership. I do want to move on to some of our other stuff, because we do only have an hour. So another big one is pacing and tone. So I think a lot of people talk about the macro of fight scenes, like what in general should be included in them and how often should they be placed in the book. But on a sentence by sentence basis, does your writing itself differ in action sequences? And how do you make those feel distinct from other sequences as far as pacing, tension, tone, all of that? If anybody wants to take that.
Again, I think it depends on the situation. A fight, the actual fight, if two people are actually like literally hitting each other with weapons or fists, that I think should be quick. The sentences should be relatively short. You're using a lot of language that's going to be quick and immediate. If it's something more involved, if it's like a grand strategy thing, you're going to write it differently. If I have one scene in my science fiction thing where there's a big battle, but the pace changes a lot. There's times when this unit is just waiting and they can hear fighting off to the left and to the right. Oh, the squad to the left's getting hit. And we don't know what's going on. But then when they're in it, it's fast. It's you're snapping a shot at a shadow that moves from place to place. You hear somebody coming around. You hear screams over here. You're trying to find each other, and it's really chaotic. But then things settle down, and there's a lot of weight. So it all depends on how you're trying to create the tone of the story. So again, the answer is it depends.
Yeah, to echo you there, Patrick. I mean, I try and keep the actual individual fights very punchy. Yeah, the action is punchy, and then, as you say, there's these lulls in the action, and then I'll try and put in some sort of slightly longer sentences of some, quite, if I try to be quite elegant with my description as the character sees something happening over there, and then bam, 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 punchy straight. Obviously a lot of my stuff's horror, so I write the action in a similar way to where I like to build tension. Yeah, that's one of my favorite things to try and do is build the tension. So the fighting and the tension and the horror tension in the way it actually comes across isn't a million miles away, and the way it's constructed isn't that different. So I mean, I definitely agree. I mean, keep the action punchy, and if you're watching something from afar, you've got the opportunity to then have a slightly sort of longer, more elegant description of something. So that's how I would go about doing that. So
Lee, something I didn't think of as far as horror is that because you write fantasy books that are supposed to scare people, right?
Apparently.
This is why I have
it's a really hard thing to do. I mean, how do you write a book? I'm sorry.
No, because I just thought that in horror, what you don't see is so important. So actually, despite your expertise, keeping the fight scenes chaotic and a little muddled is probably to your benefit, because if people feel too much like they understand what's going on, that might make it less scary.
Absolutely. I know you want to talk about point of view in a bit, but I think the point of view, sometimes a limited point of view can be a really, really effective way, so you can hear something, or it's what doesn't happen through the character's eyes that can be quite important. So, but I mean, what the actual action, I try and keep through the action quite punchy and short through the character's point of view, but I try and have this like fog of war or like a limited point of view. So to try and sort of keep the sort of tension and the fear. But again, it's the same with the horror elements to it. It's sometimes it's not what you don't see, it's when they're hiding behind the corner and something's coming, or you know, they can hear something coming or something like that. But yeah, there's definitely a similarity, strangely, between a tense horror scene and an action-packed battle scene. You wouldn't think there was, but I've noticed there seems to be some sort of correlation on how I construct it, definitely.
As far as pacing go, I mean, I'd actually quite like to hear Anna's take on this, because I think she does some of the most extraordinary things with prose. She writes some of the most incredible fight scenes.
Agreed.
Almost by deconstructing the language. It's something I've never seen another writer do.
Thank you. Goodness. I find these questions really hard to answer because I just write it and it.
That's a good answer.
Wish I had that problem.
It's the one thing. Writing is the one thing I can do, basically. Yeah, I mean, for me, yeah, it's a form of poetry. When I'm writing a battle scene, I was asked the other day after I'd done my reading about when I write my fight scenes compared to when I write my landscape descriptions, or when I write the kind of erotic poetry bits. But for me, it's all poetry of expression, of aesthetics, and of sensation. So there are periods, yeah, when I'm writing this incredibly baroque, complex, incredibly elaborate, rich, empurpled, vastly complicated sentences about the field of battle. There are passages where I'm writing these very, very staccato, almost just kind of individual words. And I mean, one of the huge influences on my writing of violence was probably James Elroy, the LA Quartet. And my agent goes berserk every time I mention this, because White Jazz, the final book in the LA Noir Quartet, is essentially unreadable. It's kind of, it's like Ulysses if the protagonist was a drug-addled LA gangster. It's basically like fuck, gun, fuck, shit, pain, fuck, heroin, fuck, gun, fuck. It's 4 pages. And then occasionally he has to drop into 2 paragraphs and he actually explains what the hell has been going on for the last 5 chapters. It is, and the most astonishing, it's an astonishing book. And it had a huge impact on me on that kind of, it's just that pure, it's like industrial music. It's just, I'm taking language and just drumming it in, smashing you over the head with it to make you feel what it would feel like to be, how I imagine it would be like to be in the midst of a massed classical style kind of wrestling match, sword fight, mass battle. And then I'll try and take you into the character's mind and how they feel, that kind of white blankness of just being just this kind of physical violence, or particularly someone like the general, the kind of weirdness of what they're doing, that these people are doing this for them. And also for me, it's intensely, writing violence is intensely political. It's an intensely sensory experience. It's an intensely sensual experience. I mean, sex and violence have been heavily linked together since way back. And that sense of, actually, this is kind of a bit erotic. This is a bit of a turn on. These are all these male bodies jammed up together. There's stuff going on there. But also the political aspect of this, these are people killing each other. What does that say about humanity? That I'm enjoying writing this and you're enjoying reading this, and these guys are probably enjoying doing this because they haven't doing this yet. And all of that, I'm just trying to kind of convey in the very imperfect form of language. If that made any sense to anyone? But yeah, no,
it made sense. I just don't know if I can execute that. I don't think I ever write that.
Not a lot of people can do that.
A little too regimented.
But I think
the pacing is that kind of moving from fast pacing to having slower period, or from lots of descriptions of battle to having dialogue and things. I think that kind of breaking things up with dialogue occasionally, or kind of breaking up pacing and things, is important. The occasional joke is probably important as well, that you have some really big solemn battle scene and then a joke to kind of leaven it a bit. Sorry, what were you saying?
Well, actually, because we were mentioning tone as well, one of the things, obviously, I mean, grimdark is a big thing in and has been for quite a while in fantasy fiction. One of the things a lot of people don't necessarily anticipate in grimdark is a lot of it is incredibly funny, especially the violent bits. And there is an awful lot of tripping up and falling on your ass in grimdark, because that kind of reinforces the reality that's being put into the fantasy genre there, because that happens. And people getting stabbed by mistake by their mate because they can't quite see who's who in the muddy battlefield, and that happened. And that kind of bathos is a major component of the grimmest and darkest of fiction. And I think it's not just something that's put in to leaven the bread. It's actually an integral part of the tone of really grim fiction, is that you need that laugh as well.
It's also really important from the point of view of, so, I mean, traditional fantasy is very much your kind of your Aragorn, your Boromir, your big, able-bodied, strong man who is healthy, who is strong. And actually, I mean, I always joke kind of that classic, which of your characters would be? Well, which of your characters would you be? Well, I'd be one of the peasant. I'd be one of the poor in the front line who was press gang down to this, hasn't got a clue what to do, tries on the one way, picks up his sword with his wrong hand, and then gets his head cut off within 2 seconds. And that was the reality of most people's lives in battle. And actually having that perspective that isn't the hero of the ages, that with every sword blow, I take out a war, I take out one of my enemies, I'm physically strong, I'm physically able, I know what the hell I'm doing, and I can do it well. That's a very, very exclusionary, problematic representation of character. I mean,
yeah. And Anna, can I take that and
yes.
So we get to maybe a couple more questions, turn it into our point of view question, which is how does switching either the style of narration and or I guess your point of view character affect the way that you write fight scenes? One of the things that I got to do in this book that I hadn't in my prior YA books is I got to, because in YA, the protagonists, the idea is that they are relatable, they're every people, they're every kids, and they're kind of being initiated into the world of the cool stuff. So they're not highly competent with the superpowers or the martial arts yet. But what I got to do with the Sword of Kaigen was write an entire cast of characters who were all seasoned martial artists. And that was like a really revelatory experience for me, just how different the action scenes became when I was like, oh, I do have the opportunity to explain all the technicalities. And then of course, running into what we discussed earlier, like how much of that is actually useful, and, you know, how do you want to pair it back to the human experience of fighting? And how is the human experience of fighting different for an Aragorn versus a Frodo? So yeah, I wanted to know if you guys had any thoughts on that and how your writing differs when you switch point of view character.
Yeah, I'll hop in on that one there. The first book I did there, Book Red or Big Red, that was written from a first person point of view, and it was told from it was basically the main character was an unreliable narrator, so you didn't really know how much of it was kind of part of his master plan or how much was fantasy and what you were actually kind of seeing. And one of the things or kind of pieces of feedback I got off a few people at different cons over here in Ireland, I suppose the main thing that kind of struck people was the violence in it, because it was from the first person. Some of the action scenes, it was all told from his eyes, so it's basically him almost talking to his inner monologue, and he's detailing what he's doing with a section, which is fine. That's fairly kind of straightforward enough, because we had maybe 8 supporting characters around him, and it's always within his kind of field of vision on a limited type of operation. But towards the end of the book, there's a much bigger one when the entire battalion goes in on an attack to basically take out an enemy position. And that's when it kind of got a bit, I suppose, crazier, because you're moving from just one narrow field of view, detailing what one individual soldier is experiencing, what he's feeling, what he can see within his field of vision. But you're trying to take a much more big kind of like epic battle scene and kind of condense it into strictly, you know, his kind of point of view, which kind of takes away from it a little bit. So what I noticed from, I suppose, from part of my own kind of experiences was switching it over to a third person point of view, which is what I did for the follow-on book, which is called Blood Red Sand. It's currently with my publisher now, but it allowed me to kind of step back away from an individual character and kind of, I suppose, have a bit of an overview of the battle scene. So in this book, it's kind of set about 20 years before Big Red, but it details like part of the backstory, which is the Allied forces invading Mars in 1954. So it kind of switches between the Allied soldiers, so basically British and French soldiers, being trapped on a foreign planet, no clue what's happening, under fire from like Nazis left, right, and center from the minute they touch down, kind of like almost like D-Day. And it's the shock and the horror of like half their team's dead, everything's thrown up in disarray, and then switching over to the point of view of these German soldiers who've been exiled for the last 10 years, again, have no clue what's happening. And that allowed me to kind of, I suppose, build these scenes in a bit more kind of, a bit more of a vast way compared to Big Red, whereas it originally was kind of a section-based thing. Now I could do company and attacks, battalion and attacks, thousands of people right across this one giant kind of war scene. So I think that's, from my point of view, writing military science fiction, from the first person, probably keep it just to the individual soldier, maybe a small little section. But if you want to do wider, more epic battles, third person, I find helps.
That was I struggled with that. Excuse me. My science fiction, my military science fiction, in every climate place, it's near future, Marine squad out doing asteroid belt patrol. And it was very easy to write. I wrote it first person. It was very easy to write the immediate stuff, the immediate fire team, extend out to the squad, extend out to the platoon. That was easy. That was very effective. That was a lot of fun. But it limited, there's only so much. If your character and your point of view character is a corporal in an infantry squad, they have no idea what is going on in the greater wide world. I've been there, and it's like, what do we do? I don't know. And so in order to pull in the bigger picture is very difficult. And I used a framing device in order to pull in knowledge for the reader so they knew what the whole story was about. But I kept the fight scenes particularly were very close, very intimate, very one person's view. And that's how I like to keep it. I know it's a different thing, but again, like what you said, it's very hard to do that on a first person to get everybody to know what's going on. One of the best. Go ahead.
So an absolute masterclass in this is actually War and Peace, the battle scenes in War and Peace, which are astonishing. And obviously, I mean, Tolstoy knew, he had been a war reporter and knew he was coming from. But you go from, so you get this astonishing scene where Count Nicholas goes into war for the first time. You have this quite astonishing scene, which I've spoken about before loads, because I mean, it is, for me, it's one of the greatest scenes in writing about fighting. And he's riding to battle, and he's like, huzzah, on his horse, huzzah. And he sees his friend ahead of him, huzzah. And then he sees some funny little flashes of light and smoke coming towards him. And then his friend kind of slumps sideways in his horse, and he can't understand why his friend is suddenly sort of slumped sideways in his horse. And suddenly he's like, oh, those are the enemy firing at us. My friend is slumped in his horse because he's dead. And my horse is running straight towards the enemy firing at us. Oh! And that's his, that's his entire experience of combat, basically. And then you switch out to Tolstoy kind of philosophizing on what Napoleon thought was going on and what the Russians think is going on, and you just get this astonishing shift between the kind of the great armies and the, you can read very detailed accounts and people's attempt to draw battle schematics, and I used actual battle schematics I used Gaugamela, I used Kume, and I used the Crossing of the Hydaspes when I was writing the big battle scenes of Broken Island in Empires of Dust. And I just used the schematics, and you can write on that kind of big macro level in terms of flanking maneuvers and cavalry columns and infantry moving around and people being rolled up. And I love that language, and just research it a bit, read a couple of books on great battles. There are some great books, Great Battles That Change History, which will give you schematics of how that works. And then you also get this intense individual experience of, you don't know what's going on, you haven't got a clue what's going on. If you've not had much experience of battle, this will be, everything that's going on will be utterly confusing to you. And you have no sense of it, and it's moving in between the two. So, I mean, a nice way of doing this is often having someone watching. So in The Tower of Living and Dying, one of the several of the big battle scenes, I have a character who's watching. So you can see the whole thing. You can move between the big perspective of seeing the whole thing and seeing it almost like a game board and having the individual character.
Adrian, did you have an add-on to that?
Purely that, I mean, I do find having that, the confused narrator who can only see a tiny slice of what's going on, is a phenomenally powerful tool to tell the story of a fight. You can, I mean, it's not a good way to tell the actual blow-by-blow account of why this battle was lost and won, but to get the emotional content of it. It's almost like in Monty Python and the Holy Grail, there is the fight with the Black Knight, and you see part of it through this narrow eye slit of one of the combatants. And it's almost like trying to capture that on the page. Is that you can hear your own breath in your ears, and you can see this tiny bit of the battlefield wheeling about. And at any given moment, a lot of the important things, such as the other person's sword, are completely out of your view and control. And it's catching that utter sort of panic and bewilderment that can really give you the big gut punch in a battle scene. More than necessarily, you can talk from the general's point of view of, oh yes, I will send my cavalry in here, and it's all very clinical and neat, and here they are routing across the river. But it's on the, I think I've got the most bang for my buck as a writer when you're getting down to, you are one of the people being trampled by the cavalry.
Yeah, I mean, actually I think it's season 2 of The Last Kingdom, the episode in that where the Northmen have come into the camp, the Mercian camp, and you get that horrible scene where Tora is trying to get Ethelthred to safety, and you get the camera's obviously on the swivel stick, and at some point the sound goes muted because presumably she can't hear properly, and you get sort of a cloth comes in front of the camera, which is her kind of pushing her way through a bit of cloth, running, and she's running through the trees, and then you get this sort of, you just get an arm coming towards her, and then you get a leg coming to, and it's really frightening, and then the sound goes muted as if like she's underwater, because it is really, it's really, really powerful, that sense of actual genuine threat and fear.
Yeah, I find limiting the point of view with that fog of war, but a limited point of view can be the best way of creating fear in your character. Absolutely, definitely.
And if you then can combine that with, and what's also interesting is the kind of the different perspectives. So again, Tolstoy has this, where you have kind of Napoleon's perspective, where he is a genius, he's got this amazing battle plan, and he says what's going to win him, and he's standing there watching it. Oh yes, this is exactly how I thought it would fall out, and all I need to do now is move my reserve up to the left, as exactly as I planned. And then you get the kind of the very cynical, perhaps the sort of cynical old soldier. I'm going to have this with Tobias in my books, where he's very much kind of like, well, it wasn't your military genius at all. It was all chance. It was all luck. You flash bastard. You think battle tactics. Everybody in the world has used these battle tactics. You were just lucky. And that all those different perspectives at once is what really kind of builds a battle, because I mean, all those battle schematics and reconstructions and accounts of, well, this is how Alexander won Gaugamela, it's because of his brilliant tactics. We don't know. And again, Tolstoy was really good on this. No one knows. Attending orders before the invention of fairly fast messaging technology, you send some bloke off on a horse to gallop round your battlefront, which is probably a good half a mile long, to tell people to do some stuff. You're not in control. No one is in control of this battle by then. It's all just chaos. And that kind of, oh yes, but the general's genius won it. There's really interesting things you can do with that in terms of the general's genius, other characters who may perhaps not feel it was a general's genius, the individual experience, And Rome does this rather nicely. The series Rome I've just been watching, where you have the two characters, Pullo and Varenus, and they're constantly, we have this kind of, oh yes, Caesar's brilliance, one. And you have, well, actually it was Pullo pulling a punch at the wrong moments was actually what won it. But obviously, Pullo knows that, but no one else knows that as far as anyone else is concerned. It was Caesar's genius what won it. And that contrast, I love that contrast. And you do so much, actually, in terms of political commentary, in terms of, the difference between the great man theory of history and the kind of democratic, a much more democratic sense of history with that kind of device.
It's famously written, isn't it? It's famously commented on about the chaos of battle and the luck involved. I mean, going right back to earlier, one of the things that's really important with the longsword fighting I do is being able to control that chaos. So if you can, it's something I'm trying to maybe put into stories. If you can have a character who's able to control the chaos around him, then he's going to be able to actually pull off things. But of course, it is luck and it is chaos, and it opens up all these doors for everything. Like Adrian was saying about when someone falls over, and all this chaotic stuff can happen, and it adds all this these layers that you can build on as devices for your characters. And it's great fun, actually. I love writing the battle scenes.
So I have I've attained permission to go a little overtime. Who started talking? Did Patrick start talking?
Oh, thank you. One of the things.
So, after Patrick goes, sorry, we're gonna let Patrick go, and then after Patrick goes, we're going to move to our audience questions because we had quite a few of those, and I want to get to at least a couple because they're really good. So, Patrick, take it, please.
Real quick, just to go into what Lee was saying about chaos and what Anna said earlier about being able to use your experiences outside of not your experience that aren't combat to channel that emotion for combat. One of the things that's helped me a lot with the chaos is the paramedic job. There are scenes where we're going out and we're in an uncontrolled environment. It's a chaotic environment. People have been injured. We have limited resources, and you're trying to control, like you said, control the chaos. And a guy that everybody listens to is the guy who's learned to control that chaos, who's at a point where they don't get upset, they don't let their emotions run away with them unseen, they can control the situation, even though it's terrible, even though you have upset family in the room, even though you have, hideous injuries that you're trying to deal with limited resources and limited people. And if you can orchestrate that and stand up there like, like a conductor and make it all make sense, that's huge. And I think that goes to some of what you're talking about with in combat. If you can take that chaos, let it wash over you and control it and see what's going on below it. And that helps a lot. And I didn't learn any of that in combat. I learned it patching up holes.
Awesome. So, so many of these, I want them to be their own panel, like just military genius versus, the power of a mass of human individuals is such a cool subject. We're gonna go to some audience questions. Levi Jacobs, and I'm so sorry if I miss yours in the chat. It's a little wonky, and I'm trying to skip the ones that I think we've already touched on, so I apologize if I miss yours. Levi Jacobs says, any thoughts on keeping the physical danger stakes believable when you have a fair amount of fight scenes / don't want to deal with a character needing to recover afterwards? So I guess in an action heavy book, how do you maintain the stakes throughout? And anybody want to take that one?
I think injuries
realistic just gets impossible. That kind of, again, that kind of level of realism where probably by chapter 2 they should all be in bed for about 6 months. you just kind of ignore that.
Like, books can take a long time. You can skip over the hospital time.
I think people should get injured, and people should then be able to deal with those injuries while the story's happening around them. And I think that adds a really interesting element to the story. So I wouldn't avoid that. I'd let them get injured and then see how your characters deal with that. Some of my characters are quite famously injured, and it's how they deal with those injuries, almost like Abercrombie with Glockter. It's how he deals with those injuries that makes him the character that you love. So I'd say go with the injuries, but
Oh, and actually, the question specifically was about danger and stakes, and I think that you can escalate stakes by injuring a character. Maybe you can't keep the choreography as fun, or you can and just throw realism out
character. Yeah, try to keep an injured character functioning.
Yeah.
Actually, that's another layer to play with, where it's like, okay, I have a scene where I have a character who's got a broken wrist, and he's still in the middle of an action scene, and he's got to deal with that, and it does make it. I think it heightens everything. I would say definitely ding him.
I think.
Up.
Sorry. I would think if it's a matter of also it's stakes and pressure, you can do a lot without actually crippling the characters as well. I mean, a near miss can bring home the stakes of a situation just as well as actually lopping an arm off.
The psychological factor as well. So like one of the stories I did had one of the main characters. He was captured in a battle and he was tortured by his enemies, and they actually tore out his one of his eyes with a very kind of hot knife. And it's how he kind of reacted to that kind of torture as well, kind of helped move his character on. So he kind of went from I suppose feeling like a captive after he went through all these months of imprisonment, and he turned that from like a defeat, as in he's physically wounded, he's feeling down on himself for being captured, and he turned that into a bit of a win in the sense that he used that to get angry. He used that because they didn't see him as much of as a threat because he was down an eye. He used that to I suppose go under the radar and basically escape. So even if the character isn't physically injured, there's a lot of psychological things that we can do to kind of, I suppose, impact the character in question.
There's also, I mean, also there's kind of a sort of sense. I mean, people always talk about my books as being incredibly violent, but there aren't actually that many big set piece fights in them, because I try and control the number I've got, just because I actually think it gets a bit, if you describe if you're writing a novel like I'm writing, which is essentially a setting in total war, if you describe every instance of total war and then every scrap as well, you're actually kind of getting a bit repetitive. It actually basically essentially turns into another.
Well, I think that ties in with the
repetitiveness. Yeah, it's balancing it.
Like, I mean, people are probably only going to be impressed that you know how to load a gun once, and then if you go and describe that every single time, it's probably going to get tiresome. You should probably find something else to do. So something that I think, Damien and Lee brought up is that I think it can be a narrative advantage to have a character who's disadvantaged in action sequences. Something I've found about my action protagonists is that against my will, often they just become short. Like, I'll just be writing and realize that, oh, why is this character 5'2"? Oh yeah, because it's more fun to.
Nothing wrong with that.
Well, and I think that there's a lot more work you have to do in an action scene. There's a lot more problem solving involved with a character who's either the same size or a little smaller than their opponents. And well, of course, there's the David and Goliath element, like you're gonna root for the smaller fighter in general, but like I also like forcing them to problem solve. So that's just something that happens subconsciously, but breaking a wrist is much better. Anyway, sorry, that was a side.
So that's made me completely think, so it's going completely off the question, but I would actually love at some point to get a panel organized, which is, and I may have mentioned this to Adrian in the past, getting a panel organized, which is people who write well about fight scenes, about violence and about the body, talking about how we might very much more inclusive fight scenes, how we might write fight scenes which include people with a very large range of physical and cognitive impairments, writing fight scenes which don't depend on able-bodiedness and strength, writing fight scenes which aren't, the kind of Daredevil, well, he's blind, but he's not really.
But
yeah, one of my favorite characters is blind.
Actually, that kind of just writing about. I did the diversity panel yesterday, and wonderful. We can talk for ages about how we want to have lots of wonderful diverse fantasies, but if we're then going to I want to really, and I don't know how you write it. It is difficult, and obviously it is difficult. And throughout, there aren't, most people who've been involved in fighting are fairly able-bodied, although they then become increasingly less able-bodied, in fact. I think it'd be really interesting to have a really, really good panel just to really, really get down to writing in much more interesting, inclusive ways about.
One of my most fighty short stories is called "The Binds That Tie," which is basically a longsword pun, and it features a blind swordswoman, and she fights because the moment the bind in sword fighting is when your swords are touching, and it's actually a sword exercise. You close your eyes and you fight in the bind, because as long as your sword touches the other person's sword, you know exactly where they are and what they're doing. So as long as she can keep the contact, she can win the fight.
Obviously, but then there's a whole kind of, that's just to keep the contact. So there's a whole kind of range of interesting to other problems, and no, that would be, and I really think this is the kind of thing that people really need to think about a lot more. So I have a fairly minor character who goes into battle strapped to a horse, because I just kind of took the kind of that sort of Tyrion Lannister having his special saddle and just thought, well, if he can have a special saddle, why can't someone use a wheelchair with a special saddle? And I'm sure someone somewhere is going, I'm sure I have a very lengthy Goodreads review. Someone's, that's hot, you need to use your knees. This is not going to work. But I was just like, fuck it, I'm just going to stick him on a special adapted saddle, strap him to his horse, and there he goes with his war sword. And that kind of stuff, I think we really need to talk much more about how we do that. We could really do that in a non-patronizing
and also,
way.
I mean, one of the things that kind of overrides an awful lot of this, or underlies, or however you want to say it, we are writing science fiction and fantasy. So you've got magic and you've got sufficiently advanced technology. And as far as injuries or disabilities or anything like this goes, there will be a way for anyone to play a full role in this kind of scene.
I've got a really great, fantastic idea for writing a story about a barbarian in their little leather pants and their leather boots. They're in a wheelchair with scythed wheels. I'll write that story.
There you go.
Blades on them like the chariots.
Yep.
Perfect.
And sorry, Lee, you had started to say something. It was a while back. If you don't have it anymore, that's fine.
I was saying about one of my favorite characters is a blind character, and writing from his point of view as a blind character in a battle scene is really quite fun. It was quite challenging, but I think that might have been. I was just adding to what those guys were saying.
Two of the best fighters I know in real life, like point fighters, which you would think is entirely based on karate and taekwondo point fighters, which you would think is really, it's important to be able to see, because you see these minute tells, and it's entirely speed based. It's not force based. It's about tapping people. But two of the best point fighters I know are, one of them is legally blind in one eye, and one of them is legally blind in both eyes. And I'm still trying to figure out how they make that work entirely, but
you'd be surprised what you compensate for.
Your logic about, like, able-bodied logic about how things are gonna work just often is just, you're not quite getting the whole thing, I found. Sorry, we're gonna go to another audience question, and I'm going to assume Virginia is gonna tell us if we are like way over time and in trouble. So Chrono Phoenician says, it feels like it's a little easier to make hand-to-hand fight sequences flow well. Do you have any tips for giving the same sense of flow to ranged combat scenes so that they don't come across choppy? And I got it on that, but I wanted to throw it to you guys.
It just is. I think it should be choppy, because if we've got swords, we approach one another and we fight with the swords. If we both got guns and we approach one of us is dead. There's going to be a lot of hiding and looking and seeing, and you see it a target briefly, you take a shot at it, and you get. There's ranged combat tends to be, at least with modern weapons, with repeating weapons, and it's a lot of hide, it's a lot of don't be seen. So it's just angry hide and seek. That's all that modern combat is. It's just angry hide and seek. And there's an awful lot of just, you don't see anything except the grass. And
This is where this kind of thing I'm trying to say about poetry, where it's to do with things like different rhythms.
Yeah, you can get weird with it, like psychologically, I bet.
Yeah, the different rhythms, the different sensations, the rhythm and the experience of some kind of ranged, particularly something like sniper combat or something, is going to be totally different to the rhythm and experience of, say, two lines of spearmen marching towards each other, or the classic kind of shield wall. Everything is going to be different. The rhythm is going to be different. The sense of what you're doing is different. So yeah, it will be choppy, and that if you do it well choppy, you're going to giving someone a really good sense of what it feels like to be inside it, because it is going to be choppy.
And there is the option of using artillery as well to kind of add to a scene. So whether it's kind of like a sword and shields kind of fantasy or a modern kind of military kind of scene, artillery I found can be just absolutely devastating and kind of like pulling the action scene along. So you might have like what Patrick said, you're playing hide and seek. So if you have a squad or a section kind of looking for an enemy, if you have a couple of mortar shells raining down on top of you, a couple of artillery shells, missiles, that can help bring the scene along, help develop it from the soldier's point of view in terms of how terrifying it is, up in the ante, and kind of, I suppose, build the tension a bit more until you can actually launch the proper section attack or get into the kill zone.
Another one we've got from the audience from PS Parker is following Damo's comment. Damo's comment. I assume that's you, Damien.
That's me.
Read. Is a fight sequence easier to tell from a third-person point of view or from first person? Does a first-person view give you greater emotional impact? So for me, I think that a first-person point of view only gets you as far as it normally gets you, which is, you know, the effect of saying I instead of the character's name. And you're otherwise you're on your own for the emotional impact. You have to make it emotionally impactful. But anybody got specific thoughts or preferences on that?
Yeah, I think.
Go ahead. No, please. Oh, cheers. So for the emotional impact, I find the first person point of view will kind of, I suppose, make it a bit more personal. I mean, if you're looking at a scene from a third person or say from outside looking in, it's lacking that impact unless you've something, I suppose, some consequence to it. Like if it's kind of like Star Wars, where it's Luke taking on Darth Vader, the whole like Luke, I am your father bit, that kind of adds a bit of resonance to it, but for the emotional impact, I find it's first person will kind of hook the reader in a little bit more, because the character is sensing it, feeling the fear of maybe dying, or kind of, I suppose, dealing with the sensation of taking another life, or the pains in the limbs. So that's where I'd be coming from with it.
Oh, so I think we need to distinguish between first and third person versus omniscient and there's the omniscient narrator, and then I'm totally blanking on. But when you're in the character's head, so I think that first person being I did this, that, and the other thing, I think only gets you so far. But then if you're doing third person omniscient narrator, is that what you're saying, Damien? Is what takes you out of the emotional experience?
Yeah, for me anyway, if you're stepping out of the character's mind, that kind of desensitizes you a little bit to it. So that's why maybe you need a little bit more in the terms of the story or something on the line to kind of up the emotional ante a little bit. But if you're inside the character's mind, that's when I think it kind of resonates a little bit more, because you're feeling everything that character's feeling,
Yeah.
I think you can do that with close third though, because I've written some of my stuff first person, and my sword and sorcery stuff I write third. But if you do close third, you can be in the character's head as a point of view character. You're still using he and or she and that, but I think you can do it. It's harder.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I kind of agree with Damien. I like first person for the intimacy of it, but it becomes harder to write the stuff around it. So it's all a trade-off.
I've mostly gone with close third for most of my fight scenes. I've never tried omniscient narrator. I think that it's really tricky, and there are relatively few writers I've seen who really pulled it off in the modern as modern writers. I know it was at one point the way you wrote books, but I think the one thing you really get when you go full on first person is that emphasizes the things the character doesn't know. It emphasizes that fog of war and the blindness and the limited vision they've got, because you effectively tied one arm behind your back at that point as far as what you can and can't describe. You can't cheat at all with what you're seeing of what's going on. But for me, close third has been sort of my favored perspective for any kind of fight.
So most of my fights are in close third person. I have written some stuff in, I tend to write when I'm writing in first person, I tend to write in first person present. So I've actually written, I've now ever republished, but it is with Black Library, a first person present tense little short from the point of view of a Chaos Marine, a Plague Marine, which that's the kind of stuff I was born to write. But I have also, there are bits in Empires of Dust where I go out into a very omnipotent third person talking about battles. So yeah, so I'm channeling kind of classic battle schematics writing, but also doing almost a kind of newspaper columnist political commentary on what's going on, the weirdness of it, a kind of God's eye view of what it looks like to see these tiny figures moving towards each other, the weirdness of what's going on, the sheer weirdness of the fact that you've got this battle going on, and then the other side of the hill you've got not a battle going on, and that kind of absolute weirdness of that kind of stuff. And I think they can all be, my writing is probably much more polemical when I'm writing in that omnipotent third. I kind of take the very kind of George Eliot-y omniscient narrator, which you're using to ram your message down the reader's throat a bit, or the kind of poetic description of it, the kind of God's eye poetic description of it. Some of the Homeric, I do Homeric similes for battles, that kind of weird godlike perspective, and they're all useful tools in devices in expressing different things and conveying different parts of the story you're telling. It's how you feel comfortable writing in the end. It's how you feel comfortable writing it, how it works, what you want to write. I don't think there's anything I can tell you your fight scene will be better if you write in first person or you write in third person, or you write it from this or that perspective. It's how it feels comfortable working within whatever it is you're trying to say.
Yeah. So I think I'm being permitted one more question. How do you tackle, Worlds in Ink asks, how do you tackle doing futuristic battles with weapons that only exist in your head?
It's easy, because there's no rules. Do what you want them to do. I did, my science fiction is relatively near future. The weapons I really extrapolated a little bit from what we have. I made the weapons that you would recognize if you'd been in the military today, a little smarter, a little more where maybe the optics of the weapon link up to a computer, stuff like that. But I didn't go crazy. I don't have anything like lightsabers or anything far-fetched. But then, like I said, it's a license to cheat.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd agree. And again, I'd be very similar, I suppose, to Patrick there. I would have wrote a lot of the technology would have been very kind of near future in terms of the weaponry. Like I think there is a weapon called a HK-17, which is is an amalgamation of the Irish infantry weapon, the Steyr 5.56 millimeter semi-automatic assault rifle, along with just like it's like a shotgun cock on, so kind of cock back in it and it fires a particle blast. I think it does that once every or 6 times a minute, so there's a bit of a recharge cycle in between. So in terms of the technology, it's sky's the limit on it, you know. You can get away with as much or as little as you want. I do find I think readers do tend to enjoy the more realistic aspect to it. So especially in terms of, you know, what I do for the military science fiction, they appreciate the kind of, at least a bit of a play on kind of modern weaponry. So kind of like Hammer Slammers focused on the tanks, and like the only change they had in that was it was a hover tank, and even the weaponry they used, they were kind of just very similar to an assault rifle nowadays. So I think if you keep the realism, it kind of adds to it, but sky's the limit on it.
I mean, for me, honestly, it's all about the logic and consistency. I'm
Yeah.
a very world first writer anyway, but if you have a good idea of the logic of what your toys can do and what they can't do, and as long as you stick within that so that you don't suddenly pull out a magic wonder thing to get you out of your third act sort of plot hole that you didn't realize you were running into, then it's going to be fine. But it's having that clear idea of where your limits are and where this particular level of technology can get you, and then that's your toy box to play with for the series.
I think, yeah, the problem comes, of course, when you have the super weapon that will destroy the entire universe, and that one side has and the other side hasn't, or you have this. So the problem I had, of course, was the problem I had in Empires of Dust, where you got a character who is essentially this kind of divine warlord figure, who is this kind of Alexander figure who's essentially unstoppable, and then you have gods and dragons, and it gets a bit kind of, you get this little in some of Malazan as well, that kind of sense of, why have we got soldiers? Why are all these that kind of, or if you had some kind of, I mean, of course, you know, the Death Star's great. The Death Star has its flaw, because it's got to have its flaw, and it's got to actually be quite easy to destroy, because otherwise your films of 2 or 3 of Star Wars are going to be really, really boring, because they're just going to be this thing just going around blowing everything up. It's that balancing technologies or magics or whatever, so you don't have the kind of, there's the one little guy there, and then there's the guy with the massive laser cannon, massive nuclear laser cannon, and that's just never going to work as a fair fight.
Yeah, we're kind of dipping into the magic systems panel territory.
Yeah,
now.
that kind of, yeah.
About,
how do you make, yeah, how to
set limits on magical powers to make them not dumb and like disruptive to the story. And I think a good rule of thumb for all of that is one of Pixar's rules of writing, and it's for coincidences, but their rule is coincidence to get characters into trouble is great, coincidence to get characters out of trouble is cheating. And I think that you can just, you know, insert Death Stars or big guns or magic wands in there as well. Like if you're going to have an intervening god or something, you know, have them get the characters into trouble, not out of it. And then you'd avoid Deus Ex Machina. Lee, we haven't heard from you in a while. Did you have any thoughts on that last question before we wrap it up?
Well, I say in mine, I don't really write much. There's very little magic. There's no magic weapons. I write basically low fantasy.
Oh, no magic.
So I don't really use much. I mean, there is like I suppose there's a god sort of evil presence type thing, and there's the zombies, I suppose, are made magically, but generally I don't really use it. So I was just sort of sitting back and letting the guys who know use that stuff talk. So
in the future, I hope we can do like a whole panel on magic weapons, or just weapons in general, actually. So if we get to do this next year, that's going to be my pitch. Yeah.
But if we get to do this next year, we're not doing this next year. Next year, meeting face to face.
Next year we're going outside.
2021.
This next year or nothing.
But wonderful as this has been.
Hopefully it's not necessary next year.
Let's do it anyway, but let's not call it.
Anyway, Virginia, thank you so much for letting us go way over time. Thank you to QuaranCon for organizing this. And oh my gosh, you guys, this was so much fun. Thank you all for coming to this panel that I wish could have gone on forever. Once again, anybody who's still watching, please check out the website QuaranCon2020.com. Check out our Artist Alley, where people have stuff for sale and you can support them in the weird conventionless pandemic time. And that's about it. Oh, and please find all the authors' links to their websites and books and stuff in, I believe, comment under this video. Thank you so much, and goodbye.